It began with a sealed legal briefing delivered through a private entrance at Clarence House, one so sensitive that even senior aides were reportedly denied access. But the moment King Charles III emerged from that closed-door meeting, pale and visibly shaken, palace insiders knew something catastrophic had happened. What had once been dismissed as mere tension inside the royal household was suddenly transforming into a devastating constitutional family crisis. And at the center of it all stood Queen Elizabeth II's final will and Queen Camilla's future at Sandringham. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. According to whispers now spreading through the highest levels of royal administration, the meeting itself had been arranged under conditions so secretive that even trusted household staff were reportedly instructed to leave entire corridors empty. Solicitors connected to the late Queen's estate allegedly arrived through a side entrance normally reserved for security-sensitive government briefings, triggering immediate concern among palace observers who had already sensed weeks of unusual tension surrounding Sandringham. At first, aides reportedly attempted to dismiss the growing speculation as routine legal housekeeping tied to estate management. But the atmosphere inside Clarence House quickly told a very different story. Insiders claim the king listened in near silence as the final interpretation of Queen Elizabeth II's will was carefully explained line by line, revealing restrictions that allegedly stunned even those closest to the monarch himself. What made the situation especially explosive was not merely the legal complexity of the will, but the emotional weight attached to Sandringham itself. For generations, the estate had never been viewed as simple private property. It was regarded as sacred royal geography, deeply woven into the emotional fabric of the monarchy and the identity of the House of Windsor. Reports suggest Queen Elizabeth II viewed Sandringham not as a residence to be casually inherited through marriage, but as a protected sanctuary tied directly to the continuity of the bloodline and the future stability of the crown. And according to several royal commentators now quietly discussing the matter, the legal wording allegedly created invisible barriers around the estate that prevented Queen Camilla from ever securing permanent independent authority there beyond King Charles's lifetime. The reaction inside palace walls was reportedly immediate. Senior staff members were allegedly instructed not to discuss estate matters with journalists under any circumstances, while communications teams moved rapidly to suppress growing rumors already leaking through royal press circles. Yet despite the silence, the tension became impossible to hide. Several insiders described King Charles as emotionally shattered after hearing the final legal interpreter. Irritation, with one palace source reportedly claiming the king appeared completely blindsided by the strength of the restrictions tied to his mother's final arrangements. That emotional devastation reportedly deepened once the broader implications became clear. Because this was not simply about a house, nor even about inheritance. It was about legitimacy, permanence, and the painful realization that Queen Elizabeth II may have spent years quietly shaping the monarchy's future from beyond the grave. Queen Camilla, according to various interpretations of events now circulating through royal circles, was equally stunned. Those familiar with internal palace dynamics suggest she had long believed Sandringham would naturally remain part of her royal life and influence following Charles's accession. Instead, whispers began spreading that the late Queen had allegedly designed succession protections specifically intended to preserve the estate for the direct line of heirs rather than future khans, or extended family factions. The news reportedly traveled quickly to Prince William and Princess Anne, both of whom were quietly informed before much of the wider royal household even understood what was unfolding. That detail alone triggered a fresh wave of speculation inside the palace. Why were Anne and William informed so early? And why, according to several insiders, did neither appear remotely surprised by the legal outcome? As those questions spread through private offices, drawing rooms, and press corridors, another rumor began surfacing with increasing frequency. Some palace insiders now whisper that Queen Elizabeth II had been planning this for years, long before the public ever noticed fractures inside the modern monarchy. Long before Charles's illness transformed the balance of power within the family, and long before succession tensions intensified behind closed doors, the late Queen allegedly understood exactly how vulnerable the institution could become if Sacred Row Yale assets ever drifted too far from the direct line of continuity. And if those whispers are true, then what unfolded inside Clarence House that day was not an accident, nor a misunderstanding, but the activation of a strategy quietly prepared long before anyone realized what was coming. But the real shock was not simply that Camilla had been denied, it was why Queen Elizabeth allegedly put the restriction in place long before anyone realized what was coming. For decades, Sandringham was more than a royal estate. It was the private heartbeat of the monarchy itself, a sanctuary guarded fiercely by Queen Elizabeth II long before the modern royal wars ever began. And according to whispers now echoing through palace administrative circles, she may have quietly built legal tripwires into her final arrangements to ensure that Heartbeat could never be redirected by outside influence. Long before the explosive tension surrounding Queen Camilla ever reached public attention, Sandringham occupied a sacred place inside the emotional architecture of the crown. Palace historians have often described it as one of the few royal estates that truly belong to the monarch personally, rather than institutionally, a refuge where generations of sovereigns retreated during moments of triumph, grief, illness, and uncertainty. Purchased during the reign of Queen Victoria and transformed under Edward VII into a deeply private royal sanctuary, the estate carried emotional weight far beyond its sprawling grounds and historic walls. For Queen Elizabeth II especially, Sandringham reportedly represented continuity itself. It was the place where family traditions survived political storms, where Christmas gatherings reinforced the image of unity, and where the monarchy's oldest instincts about loyalty, hierarchy, and bloodline were preserved behind closed gates. According to several royal commentators, the late Queen did not simply love Sandringham. She protected it with an almost spiritual intent. City. That is precisely why the latest revelations reportedly sent such shockwaves through royal circles. Insiders now claim that Queen Elizabeth spent years quietly ensuring Sandringham could never drift away from the direct line of succession, regardless of future marriages, palace alliances, or shifting power dynamics. Reports suggest she viewed the estate not as a gift to be inherited casually through royal marriage, but as part of what some courtiers allegedly call the bloodline legacy. In that interpretation, Sandringham belonged symbolically to the future sovereigns of the monarchy rather than to temporary occupants surrounding the throne. And according to whispers now emerging from palace administrative streams, legal advisors working closely with the late Queen allegedly crafted unusually specific occupancy protections years before her death, protections that only now are beginning to reveal their devastating implications. For King Charles III, the situation reportedly emotionally crushing because he had long assumed Queen Camilla would naturally continue holding influence within Sandringham after his accession. Those close to the king claim he viewed the estate as part of the life they had built together after decades of public struggle, scandal, and eventual acceptance inside royal life. But the reality hidden inside Queen Elizabeth's legal arrangements may have told a very different story. Sources familiar with royal estate structures now whisper that the late Queen deliberately connected portions of Sandringham's long-term protections to future heirs and succession stability rather than to the king's immediate household. Comparisons were quietly drawn to Balmoral duchy protections and older royal inheritance doctrines designed specifically to preserve continuity through the direct royal line. Suddenly, what once appeared to be ordinary estate planning began looking far more strategic and far more personal. Perhaps most revealing of all was growing speculation surrounding Princess Anne. According to various interpretations now circulating among royal insiders, Anne may have understood elements of this hidden legal framework long before much of the wider family became aware of it. That detail alone reportedly unsettled several members of Camilla's inner circle, who had initially believed the issue could eventually be negotiated privately once emotions settled. But as lawyers continued reviewing the final language, the atmosphere reportedly darkened. Palace officials allegedly realized these restrictions were not vague suggestions open to interpretation. They were precise, deliberate, and deeply connected to Queen Elizabeth's long-term vision for the monarchy after her death. And as those implications spread quietly through private offices and royal residences, tension reportedly intensified around Queen Camilla herself. Sources suggest members of her inner circle slowly began recognizing a painful possibility they had ever fully considered before, that her relationship with Sandringham might ultimately prove temporary rather than permanent. That realization reportedly transformed private unease into full-scale anxiety behind palace walls, especially as whispers grew louder that the estate's future was already being mentally positioned around Prince William and the next generation of the crown. And as lawyers examined the final language more closely, the devastating reality for Camilla reportedly became impossible to ignore. The clause itself was not explosive because of what it said, it was explosive because of what it prevented. Buried deep within layers of estate protections and succession planning, Queen Elizabeth's reported directive allegedly created an invisible wall around Sandringham that no spouse, no outsider, and no faction could permanently penetrate. And once Charles heard the interpretation in full, insiders claimed the room fell completely silent. According to Palace Administrative Y, spurs now spreading far beyond Clarence House, the legal language at the center of the crisis was crafted with extraordinary precision. Solicitors allegedly confirmed that Queen Elizabeth II's final arrangements tied long-term occupancy authority and operational influence at Sandringham directly to succession heirs rather than to marital proximity to the throne itself. That distinction reportedly changed everything. For years, many inside royal circles had quietly assumed Queen Camilla would naturally retain broad influence over Sandringham as queen consort and later as the widow of a reigning monarch. But the interpretation now being discussed behind palace walls suggested something far colder and far more deliberate. The estate, according to various interpretations of the clause, was never intended to become an independent sphere of influence detached from the direct future of the crown. That realization reportedly hit King Charles III with devastating force. Palace insiders claim the king entered the legal briefing expecting procedural clarification, not emotional devastation. Instead, he was allegedly confronted with the possibility that his mother had quietly structured Sandringham's future years in advance, in order to prevent exactly the kind of inheritance ambiguity now threatening to consume the royal household. Sources close to royal legal circles began quietly using phrases like inheritance containment and succession preservation, describing a framework allegedly designed to keep sacred royal estates insulated from factional influence, competing family loyalties, and future internal instability. The implications were staggering. Because if those reports are true, Queen Elizabeth was not merely organizing her private affairs before death. She was protecting the monarchy from future fracture long before the public even recognized how vulnerable it had become. For Queen Camilla, however, the emotional consequences reportedly felt deeply personal. According to insiders familiar with tensions inside the palace, the restrictions allegedly left her unable to establish any lasting independent claim over Sandringham's future operations beyond King Charles's reign. That detail reportedly transformed what might have been viewed as legal caution into something far more humiliating. Several figures connected to Camilla's inner circle allegedly argued in private that the arrangement isolated her symbolically from the very heart of the monarchy she had spent decades struggling to enter. And while no official statement ever emerged publicly, royal commentators began noticing something unusual almost immediately: silence. A profound and carefully managed silence from Camilla's camp. No confident briefings. No subtle press messaging. No quiet reassurances through royal correspondence. Only growing tension and increasingly nervous speculation. At the same time, attention reportedly shifted toward Prince William. According to multiple palace interpretat, ions now circulating through royal media circles, the late Queen's arrangements may have significantly strengthened William's future authority over Sandringham in ways not fully understood until now. Some insiders even describe the legal framework as a form of silent succession reinforcement, ensuring that the estate's long-term identity remained inseparable from the next generation of sovereign leadership. Comparisons quickly emerged to earlier royal inheritance conflicts that had haunted the monarchy for decades when competing loyalties, remarriages, and succession anxieties created dangerous fractures inside the institution. But according to historians familiar with Queen Elizabeth's instincts, the late monarch spent her reign studying precisely those historical wounds. And if current reports are accurate, she may have spent her final years ensuring they could never repeat themselves under her son's reign. What made the entire situation even more emotionally explosive was the unbearable position in which it reportedly left King Charles himself. Palace insiders describe a monarch trapped between two powerful forces: loyalty to the woman he fought decades to protect, and obedience to the institutional legacy of the mother who shaped the modern monarchy. Every interpretation of the clause reportedly deepened that conflict further. Because the more lawyers examined the language, the clearer it allegedly became that Queen Elizabeth's planning was not accidental, vague, or symbolic. It was strategic, deliberate, calculated with the kind of quiet precision only she could execute. And as media figures continued detecting unusual restraint from Camilla's allies, whispers inside palace corridors reportedly intensified into something far more dangerous than legal confusion. Senior courtiers allegedly began recognizing that the battle unfolding around Sandringham was no longer simply about property rights or inheritance wording. It was rapidly evolving into a larger struggle over who truly controlled the monarchy's future after Queen Elizabeth's death. But the legal restriction was only the beginning, because behind palace walls, an even larger battle over legacy and control was already unfolding. For Queen Camilla, the humiliation reportedly cut deeper than any public headline ever could. Because this was not simply about property. It was about legitimacy, about belonging, about whether Queen Elizabeth II ever truly intended for her to stand permanently inside the sacred geography of the monarchy, or merely beside it for a passing chapter of history. Inside palace walls, the whispers allegedly became impossible to ignore. Not loud, not public, but cold, careful, devastating whispers that moved through private corridors and drawing rooms with terrifying precision. According to reports circulating among royal insiders, Camilla was said to have taken the interpretation of the late Queen's wishes as something deeply personal. Not a logistical adjustment, not an institutional safeguard. A judgment. A final emotional verdict delivered from beyond the grave by the only woman whose approval could never truly be replaced. And that wound, insiders claim, began quietly reshaping everything around her. Because while the monarchy presented its familiar image of composure to the public, something far more fragile was allegedly unfolding behind closed doors. Courtiers reportedly noticed a growing emotional distance between King Charles III and Queen Camilla, subtle at first, then harder to dismiss. The tension was never described as explosive. That was what made it more unsettling. Long silences, separate consultations, conversations reportedly ending early whenever certain subjects surfaced. Those closest to the institution allegedly feared the king was being pulled in two impossible directions. At once between loyalty to the woman who had stood beside him through decades of scandal and sacrifice, and loyalty to the institutional machinery. Mary's mother spent 70 years protecting at all costs. And for Camilla's supporters, the restrictions surrounding Sandringham reportedly symbolized something unbearable. Some allegedly described it as a final rejection. A message hidden beneath legal wording and royal protocol. Because in royal history, access has always meant acceptance. Residences are not merely homes. They are symbols of permanence, of rank, of who truly belongs within the bloodline's protected center. The idea that Sandringham might ultimately belong not to the current queen, but emotionally and symbolically to the next reign, reportedly struck at the heart of Camilla's deepest insecurities about her place inside the monarchy. Meanwhile, public image concerns allegedly began eclipsing the private emotional crisis itself. Palace advisors were reportedly terrified that any visible fracture could spiral into another catastrophic media war at the worst possible moment. Charles, already facing enormous personal strain with Hyle battling illness, was said to be under immense pressure to prevent institutional conflict from becoming public spectacle. Every appearance suddenly mattered, every expression, every carefully measured interaction. Because the palace understood something dangerous: public sympathy can shift quickly when royal vulnerability collides with questions of inheritance, legitimacy, and exclusion. At the same time, Prince William and Princess Anne reportedly maintained deliberate public silence, refusing to engage outwardly with the growing speculation. But behind the scenes, insiders allegedly claim both figures were increasingly focused on consolidating stability around the future of the crown. Not through confrontation, through preparation, through control, through ensuring that the transition toward the next era of monarchy remained protected from emotional fractures that could weaken the institution itself. And that quiet coordination reportedly sent a chilling message throughout royal circles. The future was already being carefully organized, with or without harmony in the present. For courtiers watching events unfold, the comparisons to earlier royal fractures became impossible to avoid. Memories of exile, exclusion, divided loyalties, and succession tensions reportedly resurfaced with alarming intensity. Some insiders allegedly feared that if private frustrations ever leaked into public view, the monarchy could face another cycle of internal warfare capable of consuming the institution for years. Because royal history has shown, time and again, that the most dangerous battles are rarely fought in public first. They begin in silence, in wounded pride, in private resentment buried beneath ceremonial smiles. But the most devastating realization had yet to arrive because Queen Elizabeth's final move may never have been about Camilla alone. Even in death, Queen Elizabeth II still appeared to be shaping the monarchy from beyond the grave. Through wills, estate structure, trusted advisors, and carefully constructed lines of succession, the late Queen reportedly designed a system that would outlive personal emotions, scandals, and even family fractures. And now, according to those closest to the institution, that system was activating exactly as she intended. For decades, Queen Elizabeth was said to understand one brutal truth better than anyone around her. Monarchies do not collapse in moments of public outrage alone. They weaken slowly through emotional compromises, private favoritism, and blurred lines between personal desire and institutional responsibility. That belief reportedly shaped every major decision she made during the final years of her reign. While the public saw ceremonies, handshakes, and carefully measured appearances, insiders claim the late Queen was quietly building protective barriers around the future of the crown itself. Not for one reign, for the reigns still to come. And nowhere did that hidden architecture reportedly become more visible than at Sandringham. Because Sandringham was never merely about land, wealth, or royal privilege. To those inside palace circles, it represented continuity, stability, a sacred thread connecting generations of sovereigns to the identity of the monarchy itself. That is why the growing tensions surrounding its future allegedly became so emotionally explosive. The estate transformed into a symbolic battleground between personal attachment and institutional duty, between the emotional needs of the present and the carefully guarded survival plan designed for the future. According to royal insiders, King Charles III increasingly found himself trapped within that conflict. Not publicly, never publicly, but privately, reports suggest he was being forced to confront the painful reality that even as monarch, there were boundaries his mother had already established long before her death. Boundaries designed not to punish him, but to protect the institution from instability after him. And that realization reportedly weighed heavily on a man already carrying the physical and emotional strain of illness, public scrutiny, and the impossible burden of preserving unity within a fractured royal family. At the same time, Princess Anne and Prince William allegedly emerged not as aggressors, but as guardians of continuity. That distinction mattered deeply within palace walls. Insiders reportedly insist their role was never about humiliating Queen Camilla or challenging Charles personally. It was about maintaining the late Queen's long-term blueprint exactly as intended, quietly, carefully, relentlessly. Courtiers allegedly described the situation in stark terms: the old guard securing the next reign. And in those words lay the true fear haunting the institution that sentiment, sympathy, and personal loyalty could never be allowed to override succession stability. For Queen Camilla, however, that shift reportedly became increasingly isolating, because while she remained queen, beside Charles, insiders whisper that the structures shaping the monarchy's future appeared to place their emotional weight elsewhere, toward continuity, toward William, toward the transition already forming beyond the current reign. And the more those future-centered discussions intensified behind closed doors, the more some palace figures allegedly feared Camilla was becoming separated from the deeper succession framework guiding the monarchy forward. Outside palace gates, public sympathy reportedly began gravitating toward Charles himself. Not as king alone, but as a son still living beneath the enormous shadow of a mother whose influence refused to fade, even after death. Commentators increasingly speculated that the emotional and institutional pressures surrounding Sandringham, succession planning, and royal stability could quietly accelerate preparations for the William era sooner than many once expected. Not through crisis, through inevitability. Because in the end, Archie was never designed to function as personal property. That was the lesson Queen Elizabeth reportedly spent her entire life protecting. The crown, in her view, was a sacred trust passed carefully between generations, never fully belonging to any one individual, no matter how powerful, beloved, or wounded they became. And perhaps that is why her final influence now feels so haunting inside royal circles. Even absent, she still appears to define the limits of power itself. And as silence settled once again over Sandringham's cold winter grounds, one truth reportedly lingered above all others. Queen Elizabeth may have left the throne behind, but not control over its future. For King Charles III, the crisis unfolding around Sandringham reportedly became far more painful than a legal dispute. It was a collision between two worlds he had spent decades trying to hold together: his devotion to Camilla and the unbreakable shadow of Queen Elizabeth II's institutional vision. And insiders now whisper that the strain of balancing both may have left the king more emotionally exhausted than ever before. Because beneath the titles, ceremonies, and carefully rehearsed public appearances, Charles allegedly found himself confronting the same brutal reality that has haunted monarchs for centuries. The crown does not bend easily for personal happiness. It demands sacrifice, relentlessly. And according to palace whispers, that truth began pressing harder on Charles with every passing week as tensions surrounding Sandringham intensified behind closed doors. Sources close to the institution reportedly described private meetings that became increasingly emotional, tense, and difficult to contain. Discussions that once centered on logistics allegedly transformed into painful confrontations about legacy, loyalty, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. Some insiders claim Charles appeared visibly worn down during these conversations, caught between advisors urging caution and Camilla's growing frustration over what she reportedly viewed as deliberate distancing from the monarchy's long-term succession structure. And for a man who had spent much of his life fighting to protect the relationship that eventually became his marriage, the emotional weight of that conflict was said to be devastating. At the heart of the crisis reportedly stood Queen Elizabeth's final influence, a presence so powerful that even after her death, it continued shaping the decisions of those left behind. Charles allegedly understood better than anyone that his mother did not build her plans around emotion. She built them around survival, stability, continuity. That realization reportedly forced him into an impossible position: protect the woman who stood beside him through scandal, humiliation, and decades of public hostility, or honor the institutional framework his mother believed would safeguard the crown for generations after him. And while Charles struggled with that burden privately, Ace advisors were allegedly becoming increasingly firm in their recommendations. According to insiders, senior figures within the royal household quietly encouraged the king to prioritize institutional continuity over personal loyalty at every critical turning point. Not because they lacked sympathy for him, but because they feared instability more than emotional fallout. The monarchy, they believed, could survive heartbreak. What it could not survive was uncertainty surrounding succession authority and the long-term transfer of symbolic royal power. Meanwhile, reports suggest Queen Camilla grew increasingly frustrated by the rising influence of Princess Anne and Prince William during this period. Palace staff allegedly began rallying around what many privately described as future reign stability, reinforcing structures that appeared more focused on the monarchy after Charles than the emotional realities within the current reign itself. And that shift reportedly deepened the isolation. and surrounding the king, who insiders claim began feeling trapped between two forces neither willing to retreat. For some royal historians, the parallels became painfully familiar. Charles was no longer seen simply as a reigning monarch navigating family disagreement. He was being compared to earlier sovereigns forced to surrender personal desires in service of the institution. Kings and queens who discovered too late that the crown often demands emotional sacrifices no ordinary life could survive. And perhaps that is what made this moment feel so tragic to those watching closely. Charles had waited his entire life to become king, only to allegedly find himself imprisoned by the very system he inherited. At the same time, public sympathy toward him reportedly began growing, not out of political loyalty, but human empathy. Because beyond the headlines and speculations stood an aging monarch battling illness, while carrying the emotional collapse of two competing worlds inside his own house. Behold, Sandringham itself gradually evolved into something far larger than an estate. It became a symbol of the monarchy's unforgiving rules, the place where personal love collided with institutional permanence, and where duty once again appeared to triumph over desire. But while Charles struggled privately with heartbreak and duty, the monarchy itself was already moving toward a new and irreversible balance of power. In the end, the battle over Sandringham was never truly about one estate, one clause, or even one queen consort. It was about the brutal reality at the heart of monarchy itself. The crown survives not through emotion, but through continuity. And according to the whispers now echoing across palace corridors, Queen Elizabeth II understood the truth better than anyone. For years, the monarchy had appeared to revolve around personalities, scandals, rivalries, and fragile reconciliations. Public attention moved constantly from one emotional crisis to another, creating the illusion that individual relationships still held the power to reshape the institution itself. But behind the scenes, insiders claim Queen Elizabeth spent the final chapter of her reign preparing for something far greater than temporary public storms. She was allegedly preparing the monarchy to survive the people inside it. That was the deeper meaning hidden beneath the growing tensions surrounding Sandringham. The estate became more than land, more than inheritance. It became a final test of whether the crown would remain tied to institutional continuity or drift into emotional uncertainty during one of the most fragile transitions in modern royal history. According to palace figures, Queen Elizabeth's will was never viewed internally as an emotional gesture. It was seen as a mechanism of protection, a carefully constructed safeguard designed to preserve long-term royal stability after her death, regardless of personal consequences. And as the implications reportedly became clearer inside palace walls, one reality began quietly settling over the institution. Sandringham did not belong emotionally to any single reign. It belonged symbolically to the endurance of the crown itself. That realization reportedly strengthened Prince William's future authority in ways the public may never fully witness. Not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively. Insiders allegedly describe a slow consolidation already unfolding behind closed doors, with senior royal figures increasingly aligning around the future structure of the monarchy rather than the emotional tensions of the present. And standing firmly within that process, according to persistent palace whispers, was Princess Anne. Over time, Anne reportedly emerged as one of the monarchy's most trusted guardians of continuity and royal legacy structures. Not because she sought power, but because she represented discipline, loyalty, and institutional memory at a moment when the crown desperately needed stability above all else. Court ears allegedly viewed her as one of the final living links to Queen Elizabeth's uncompromising philosophy of duty before self. And as uncertainty surrounding Sandringham intensified, Anne's influence reportedly grew quieter, colder, and more important than ever. For King Charles III, however, the outcome carried a devastating emotional cost. Sources close to the institution claimed the king increasingly understood that certain realities could no longer be resisted, even by the sovereign himself. During years already overshadowed by illness, personal strain, and growing pressure surrounding succession planning, Charles reportedly found himself forced to accept the painful limits imposed by the institution he had waited his entire life to lead. The crown had finally demanded from him the same sacrifice it demanded from generations before him: duty over attachment. And for Queen Camilla, insiders suggest the atmosphere gradually became more isolating with each passing month. Though she Ened Queen beside Charles, palace discussions surrounding the monarchy's future allegedly centered less on the current reign and increasingly on what came after it. Succession priorities appeared to narrow the boundaries of her long-term position inside the royal structure, leaving many to quietly wonder whether Queen Elizabeth's final framework had always intended exactly that outcome from the beginning. Yet perhaps the most haunting detail of all was not conflict but silence. Because according to those inside royal circles, open warfare never truly arrived. No dramatic public collapse. No visible rebellion. Instead, the palace reportedly settled into a cold, uneasy quietness where everyone understood the outcome without needing to speak it aloud. And in that silence, the monarchy revealed its oldest and harshest truth. Individuals may suffer, relationships may fracture, emotions may break beneath the weight of the crown, but the institution itself continues forward, untouched, demanding endurance above all else. And somewhere beyond the locked gates of Sandringham, beneath the silence of its winter fields and ancient royal walls, the absent queen's final strategy appeared to endure exactly as intended: unyielding, invisible, and impossible to overturn. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.